Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the British Columbia Museums Association webinar. My name is Anissa Paulson, and I will be your host for today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the BCMA offices are located on the traditional lands of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. We are grateful for the opportunity to live and learn here in mutual respect and appreciation. We also recognize the traditional lands of the many nations across British Columbia where the work of the projects described in this webinar has been carried out, and where all of the volunteers in our sector are working today. Today's webinar topic is top tips for effective volunteer programs, and it's presented today by Tracey Gibson, who is the Manager of Learning and Training at Volunteer Victoria. Many of you may already be aware that this week is National Volunteer Week, and I just want to take a brief moment to thank all of the wonderful volunteers that serve our museum and cultural heritage sector every day. According to Canadian Heritage, the BC cultural sector has over 19,500 volunteers that contribute over 1 million volunteer hours each year. And as Lisa Mort-Putland, the Executive Director of Volunteer Victoria, once told me, to be a volunteer, it's not a job description, it's a pay scale. And I have always loved that quote. And I think there's no doubt that the dedication, passion, and unwavering energy that all of the volunteers working in our sector put into the museums, galleries, and cultural centers every month. It's really the foundation upon which our sector is built. So thank you all very much. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank our webinar sponsor today, Lucidia. Lucidia is a software solutions company based in Richmond, British Columbia. And they develop collections management software systems that are suitable for libraries, archives, and museums, both large and small. Lucidia's motto is redefine how knowledge is shared, which I have always thought is quite fitting for a webinar sponsor. So we thank Lucidia for supporting BCMA as we seek to share knowledge through our webinar series. As I mentioned, I'm Anissa Paulson, your host for today, and I'm also BC Museum Association Program Officer. If you are having technical issues, please call or email Alicia, who is our operations manager, and she's standing by to assist. Feel free to also send me a text, although my phone just went into an automatic update, so I'm not sure I'll be able to receive it. Okay, so a bit of housekeeping before we begin. If you are reading the slide and hearing me talk, you are doing great. If you can't, please phone the office. As well, throughout the webinar, and now if you are having issues, you can use the chat button. You may have to scroll over the top or the bottom of your screen to have the menu bar emerge, but if you want to press the chat and type into the chat, that's a good way to ask questions throughout the webinar. And I know Tracey will encourage you to ask questions at any point during the presentation. It's not necessary to wait until the end. So this month's presenter is Tracey Gibson. And as I mentioned, she's the Manager of Learning and Training at Volunteer Victoria. Tracey is a fourth-generation Victorian who loves living on the West Coast. She has over 15 years experience in the nonprofit sector, and for the last 5 years has been coaching individuals and facilitating workshops. Tracey has a Leisure Services BA from UVic and a Certificate Executive Coaching from Royal Roads University. Tracey has volunteered for most of her life and currently finished her term as past president with Volunteer Victoria. One of her most memorable volunteer experiences was going to New Zealand for the Eco Challenge. We are excited to have Tracey with us here today. So now over to you, Tracey.
Great, thanks Anissa, and welcome everybody. It's great to see just about 20 people, I think, online right now, and I know there's a few more that will be watching this recording later on. So fantastic, and I just really want to echo what Anissa was saying in regards to National Volunteer Week, and to acknowledge the amount of effort and time and resources and knowledge and wisdom that comes from our many volunteers all around BC. So thank you so much for contributing to your community and for being such a huge part of making your community thrive. I've got a lot. I was going through my content earlier and I realized I have a ton of content to share with you today, which I'm really excited about. And hold on. Sorry, I just want to make sure that my slides are shared right now. And Anissa, can you let me know if you can see my slides?
Yep, we can see them.
Are they?
If you want to just put it in, yep, go like, I think press that presentation mode and then it'll fill the whole screen.
Why is it not doing that?
The little button up in the left, top left corner, a little bit further to the right, in the red bar.
Stop? No, sorry.
Above the word insert. There you go.
Why is it not doing that?
Try it again.
Okay, we gotta love technology, everybody. I know. Okay, I'm just gonna stop that for a second, and then because I have another screen that's open, so I'm wondering if that is.
I swear we just practiced this 10 minutes ago and it worked beautifully.
I know. How is that? Okay. Okay. Now I think we're there. Are we there? Can you see?
No, yeah, I think you have to press share screen again.
Oh, I did that. Okay.
There you go. Got it.
Okay, perfect. Excellent. Sorry about that, everybody. It's always the technology pieces that need to come together for these webinars. So my goal today is to really share some tips for you for an effective volunteer program. And I mean, some of this might be things that are applicable to you. Some might be just not applicable because of the size or how the structure of your organization is, how you work. I don't want it to overwhelm anybody. I don't want everybody to go, oh my gosh, we're not doing things. Really, these are tips that if you have them, great. If you're doing them, celebrate that. But things to work towards, or maybe these are things that you can take away and go, oh yeah, this is something that we really do need. So definitely, please don't go into any kind of stress mode after hearing some of these tips. I think the biggest thing for me that I have found over the years that I've been in the nonprofit sector is how volunteer management has actually changed. So we used to have volunteer, and the volunteer programs used to be at the side of most people's desk. And that may still be true for some smaller organizations. But what we're seeing in general is that volunteer management has changed significantly. There's process, there is structure. We have professionals in the sector who are learning about how to provide the best experience for volunteers. So it's really changed, and that's where I hope some of these tips help in sort of adding to whatever is happening within your program right now. Okay, so my screens are not, my slides are not, oh, there we go. Okay, so what I've based this next 30 minutes on, and just to let you know that I could go on probably for 3 hours on many of these topics. So trying to fit this all in the 30 minutes is tight, but we're gonna go for it. So what I've really based this on, though, is the volunteer management engagement cycle. And this is something that all organizations can really use as a guiding tool to what is happening within their volunteer engagement program. So we've got your needs assessment, planning for volunteers, recruitment, screening, orientation and training, support and supervision, retention and recognition. And as we go through these next 10 tips, you'll see that they fit within this engagement cycle. And I encourage you, if you haven't ever seen this engagement cycle before, Volunteer Canada has some great resources that help explain this cycle, as well as the Canadian Code for Volunteer Involvement, which outlines the 10 standards. And I really didn't want to go too deep into the 10 standards today because there's just so much information. But there are some really good guides, there's some good standards and some good principles, again, that things that you can work towards. So the number one strategy that I want to talk about here, or the number one thing that I'm going to start talking about right now, is volunteer engagement as a strategy. And so what do I mean by that? What we're finding in organizations is that when your volunteer program is a strategy within your strategic plan of your organization, that's when they have the most success. When you're bored, when everybody is all on the same page about the value and the importance of volunteers in your organization. So this is really key because it gives, if it's a part of your strategic plan, then it is something that gets talked about continuously at your board meetings. So this might not be something that you have any responsibility for in terms of your strategic plan. And the reason why I really wanted to bring this up today was because it's a really good conversation piece to have with the decision makers within your organization. What is the priority for volunteers within our organization? Our questions, is a question you can ask. How are we incorporating volunteer engagement into our strategic plan? Is volunteer engagement a part of our mission? Have we got specific goals in place to support volunteer engagement? And what kind of infrastructure do we have to support this program? So again, this is a high level kind of tip, and it's about starting that conversation to ensure that volunteer engagement isn't a part, or is not sort of the afterthought. And the more we intertwine volunteers into everything we do into our organization, what we find is that you're going to have much more success of the things we're going to talk about later, like recruitment and retention, and being able to really have success with your volunteer program. Now, I know it always feels weird when you're doing a webinar, because I would always love to sort of touch base with people and see sort of thoughts and comments. So please feel free to go into the comment section, like Anissa pointed out. And if you have any comments and questions, Anissa's going to kind of keep track of those for me, and we can sort of talk about them towards the end. And if there's something really glaring at you, you can always just say, I need to know right now, and she can interrupt me, because I actually can't see the chat box right now. Okay, so the number two tip that I want to share is being prepared. And this again is sort of at that high level decision maker kind of part of your volunteer program. But sort of are your staff prepared for volunteers within the organization? Do they understand the roles of the volunteers? Do they understand the value of volunteers and how they integrate into your organization? And this is, this is an important piece, like to note, to have that preparation and to have everybody really prepared for that, because you don't want to recruit a volunteer, pass them off to somebody or into a different area, and they not having the same vision, the same idea of the experience for that volunteer. Risk management. We hear about risk management. It's one of those things that we don't always want to dive into, but when we're looking at volunteers, it is really key to understand what risks are involved. We're going to talk about job description, positions in a little bit, but really understanding the risk that you are putting a volunteer in, is there any risk? Doing those assessments, making sure that you've thought through those pieces. And this is the being prepared. This is the planning part of the engagement cycle. And evaluation. How do we evaluate what we need? How do we evaluate our volunteers? How do we evaluate and making sure how things are going with that? So these are the things that often get missed when we are talking about volunteer management. And we tend to just go, oh, but I need a volunteer to do this specific task. And we're not prepared beforehand before bringing that volunteer in. So really kind of take that time, that planning time, that to sort of see where are you and what do you need to do to be ready for volunteers. So our next slide is all about, do you have a recruitment plan? And again, that comes back to the being prepared piece. Being specific with your recruitment for volunteers is not just being general, asking volunteers, what do you need? Like not just being general, like we need a warm body, but what do you need to provide the services of your organization? And the more specific you can be with those type of things, the more success you're going to have in getting the right volunteer and the right fit for your organization. Titles matter. We can spend time putting together position descriptions for our volunteers, and we might come up with a very basic, simple title. And I just want to let you know, like, people are attracted to the titles of volunteer positions. There was an organization, Wild Ark, that does animal rescue, and they had a position that was called, it was about helping to prep food for the animals. And I think that's really, it was like a coordinator or food coordinator was what they called that. And they were getting nobody. They got nobody interested in that volunteer position. They changed the title to, they've changed the title to meal planner or meal prepper. And all of a sudden, they got a whole whack of people interested in that position. So just remember that the titles do matter and are a great recruitment tool for you. Flexibility. You may have a volunteer with that shows up on your doorstep with very specific skills and strengths, but you don't actually have an actual position for that person. And it is being able to, how can we use this person who wants to volunteer, who has some great skills, but we just didn't actually know that we needed them. So being flexible with that. You also may have positions and not maybe attract the people with those skills and the strengths that you think need to fill those positions, but be flexible and be sort of open to say, hey, we've actually got some volunteers within our organization. Are they willing to actually try going into a different position? Are they willing to learn new skills? So when we have flexibility in our recruitment plan, it all of a sudden opens it up to other opportunities for us with our volunteers. Okay, screening. We probably hear a lot about screening and should you screen or not screen? Many different organizations are going to have very different levels of screening, and depending on the population that you work with, again, you're going to have very different levels of screening. So just quickly, and I know this is kind of hard because I can't see the chat, but just quickly, why do we screen volunteers? And maybe if you guys can just put in some answers into the chat box, that would be great. And Anissa, if you can read a couple or a few of them to me, that would be great.
We're very shy and quiet, it looks like, so far. Oh, here we go. They're coming in now. It looks like people are suggesting because volunteers are working with children, And likewise, if they're working with children, then we will sometimes need to do a background check beforehand. Also, just general safety and security concerns, as well as generally to assess whether or not their interests align with the job description.
Brilliant. Awesome. Yes. Our main purpose for screening volunteers is to create and maintain a safe environment. And we want to ensure that there's a consistent, transparent process for all candidates. Many of you probably already know that Volunteer Canada does have the 10 steps of screening, and that's available on their website. So I'm not going to go through those 10 steps, but I really wanted to bring this up because what we hear from people is, well, why do we have to go through this screening process? Why? And like some of you have already mentioned, the vulnerable populations that people are working with, whether that is children or seniors, and again, making sure that this becomes part of your risk management plan and your planning. And this is, again, just making sure that everybody is safe. And when you look into, and you look at the 10 things of screening, it also includes, feedback to your volunteers. It's not just your criminal record checks, but it is about what kind of application form do you have? What is your interview process like? This is your screening process is really about safety, getting to know your volunteer, and making sure that there's the right fit for both the organization and the volunteer. All right, so our big thing when we bring on volunteers into our organization is making sure that we're really setting them up for success. And when we set them up for success, then we know that if we provide that orientation and training piece, that they're going to feel welcome. It's going to really clarify the relationships, the expectations, the boundaries that you have within your organization. And we want every volunteer to receive orientation and training so that they can feel successful and safe in their role. When we start volunteers off and we say, we just need you to come for this shift for 2 hours, and it's going to be a weekly shift, and we're going to train you as you go. What we find is that the retention piece for volunteers is less because they want to feel, but volunteers really want to feel like they're contributing. That's the thing that we hear all the time when we do focus groups, when we do any research and studies. The number one thing is they want to know that they are contributing. If there's anxiety or stress around the role that they've signed up for and they're not unsure they're really not sure what that means and what it looks like, then we find that they just don't come back. So the orientation and training is just a really key piece. It's going to look different for every organization, and that's okay. But making sure, again, coming back to that, the person who is supervising those volunteers, who's working with them, that they know what the orientation and training looks like. As well as all other staff, so that other people in your organization can say, oh yeah, this person has been trained and has been given an orientation, so I don't need to go through the basic pieces. I only need to now train them on a specific role. This can be, it can be time consuming, and that is it is such joyous work working with volunteers. Yet it also can feel like it's a lot of time and effort invested. But I can tell you that it will really pay off for you in the end to make sure that these things are in place. Okay, so number 6, listen and be curious. This is, I think, one of the best tips that I can give you with your volunteers is listen to what they have to say. We did a study a couple of years ago and asked volunteers about communicating with their supervisor or their volunteer leader or the volunteer manager in charge of them. and ask them about feedback, and did they give that person feedback when things weren't going well. And they said hands down they expected that person to come to them and ask them how they were doing. They didn't feel comfortable always going to that person in charge to say, you know, I need support, or I need some help with this, or I need some more training, or I'm not sure how to manage some conflict that's happening between another volunteer. The more you can ask questions about how things are going, the more we can provide feedback to our volunteers on a regular basis, the more they're going to feel valued and an important part of your organization. You're also going to, you know, it's going to differ too in terms of how you integrate your volunteers into your staff and your human resources piece of things. But the more you listen and actually be curious. And the two questions that I love to ask people on just in general, these are part of my everyday toolbox. What's working for you? You're going to get lots of information by just asking that question. What's not working? Again, it gives you and that volunteer an opportunity to have a conversation, and for then after that you say, okay, what I'm hearing you say is that you need some support here, or that you need some guidance with this, and we can identify those, move them forward, and really support them in that ultimate volunteer experience. Which takes me right to my tip number 7 is recognizing your volunteers. And obviously with it being National Volunteer Week, that is one of the things that we are trying to get the word out as best as we can today and this week and all throughout the year about really recognizing our volunteers. We all have that sign around our neck that says it's all about me. And when we see people and hear them and really say, yeah, like what you say matters, people feel valued. They feel like they're a part of your organization, and they feel like they're making a difference, and which is the number one thing that they want to do. They want to feel like they're making a difference. Volunteer Victoria has a mental health access program, and we have brought on a volunteer who's on his mental health journey. And at the beginning, when he first started his volunteer position with us, he was super shy, couldn't look you in the eye, really had a tough time having a conversation with you. And we started just giving him and recognizing him for what he was doing, recognizing just for showing up. Thank you so much just for being here today. Giving him that appreciation and gratitude. And he used to just come in and do very specific tasks and didn't really want to have to interact with anybody. And a year later, we have him volunteering at our front desk and as a reception person, and he is now engaged. And he said the biggest thing for him that shifted and allowed him to kind of come out of that shell was that we thanked him, that he felt valued and he felt like he was a big part of our organization. We can talk about recognition of volunteers probably for days. There's so many different ways to recognize your volunteers. And I know that many of you are probably doing all of those this week. It's just really, it comes down to making them feel valued and a part of your organization. Number 8 is understanding your volunteers. And, one of the things that we found out when we were talking to volunteer managers a couple of years ago, we did some research. And the average volunteer manager basically oversees 150 volunteers. The average corporate person who's supervising staff will oversee 10 people. So there's a huge difference there. And managing a huge number of volunteers is really the norm in many organizations. And so it can take a lot of time to, when we're talking about all of these other things, when we're talking about the whole volunteer engagement cycle, there's a lot of pieces there. I invite you, I encourage you to really get to know and understand what motivates your volunteers to be with your organization. There's a reason why they're there, and the more you can find out about that reason and understand it and build relationships with those volunteers, the more success you're going to have with them actually staying with you for a longer period of time. We have two volunteers that have been volunteering for our organization for over 20 years. And one of the things that we've been able to do is we've been able to accommodate what they need as they age. So one of the ladies that has been volunteering for the 20 years, she started to lose her memory and wasn't able to walk. Her husband used to drop her off and she used to walk up to our offices. And one day she actually got lost coming to our offices. And what we had to realize is we had to now accommodate her aging in our organization. And so we arranged with the husband that we would go down and meet him, and she would come up, and we would be able to give her some meaningful volunteer work that fit where she was at in that time. So when we have more understanding of where our volunteers are at and what they need, we can make those accommodations as we go. And I mean, I just love it when these two women come in and they've met volunteering. They've built this friendship over the last 20 years. They go for lunch together. And it's just, I think it's kind of a very special relationship that has happened. And I think it's because we've been able to grow and accommodate with them rather than saying, well, you're not able to do this position anymore, so there's no place for you in our organization. Focus your recruitment. This, comes back to sort of my previous tip, and I just wanted to reinforce it again, I guess, is really seek out people who really want to volunteer for your organization. When we are clear about who we want and need, we can attract those people to come and be a part of things. When we're not clear and when things are, when we kind of try and seek out people who may not even be interested in what you do or the organization that you are providing services for, we can get really, it can be, again, comes into that time thing. We've wasted time. We have maybe put somebody into a position that is not a right fit. And it can just kind of leave a bad taste in the volunteer's mouth if it's like, oh, this just isn't where I want to be. So try and spend that time to seek out the people who who really want to volunteer for your organization. And my last tip here is celebrate your volunteers. And this is just such I love that we do have National Volunteer Week, and it is encouraged to celebrate your volunteers this week. I encourage you to celebrate them all of the time. And how do we celebrate our volunteers? Share volunteer stories. Share with your volunteers the successes of your organization. It's so we can get very focused on sharing our stats and our numbers and our successes with our funders and our donors, and making sure that we are celebrating those same successes with our volunteers. They want to know that what they've done has made a difference. They want to know that they've had impact on your organization. So whatever that looks like in terms of celebrating your volunteers, do it loudly. Let others know, other organizations, let the community know that you've got volunteers that are doing amazing things for you, and let them know. Let them know that what they're doing has impact and is really making a difference. So I think I went super fast there, but we've got a couple of minutes left and some time for questions and comments, thoughts about sort of those 10 tips. I before I open it up to questions, I just want to say that what you do for your community and is a major impact, and we thank you so much for being a part of it. Inspiring volunteers is, like I said, it is joyous work, and there are so many fascinating people that you come across in the volunteer management world, and I'm just like really thankful that everybody here is a part of that. So thank you. Anissa, any questions, comments, thoughts?
Yeah, excuse me. Thank you very much, Tracy. I will invite all of the participants to type their questions or comments into the chat box, and I'll be happy to read them out to Tracy. I guess one thing that I'm wondering about is if you have any tips or adaptation of these tips that you just went through for people who may be the sole volunteer at their institution. And by volunteer, I mean, you know, the person who's the director of the museum and they're in a volunteer or an unpaid capacity. And just kind of, if there are any just adaptations that you might suggest for that person.
Start simple. Pick, have some goals, I think, and I think that's the key thing, is have some goals of what do you want to achieve with your volunteers, because it is a lot. If you're a director and volunteer coordinator and marketer, it's a lot for one person, but set the goals in terms of what is something you want to focus on in the year. Do you want to focus on recruitment? Is that a focus? Would you want to focus on creating position descriptions? So keeping it simple and keeping it so that it's achievable for you. And I think that's the best adaptation I can really suggest to if somebody who's overseeing tons of different jobs all in one.
Great. Okay, there are a few more questions here.
Okay.
One is, sometimes it can really be a struggle to recruit volunteers from the teenage demographic. In this person's personal experience, these teenagers seem eager to volunteer for their school hours, but then quickly they can become flaky and not show up. So is there anything you can recommend in the screening process that one could add when recruiting a younger volunteer?
Yeah, great question. Great question. It's really about finding out, and this has become where we have to be super curious, finding out what their strengths are. But what we find from youth is that it's not almost that they want to use their strengths. They're happy to use their strengths, but they want to learn new skills. So what skill set could you say to a youth volunteer, here's a position, and when we feel that you could learn these skills, is this of interest to you? So that it's like they want to see themselves progressing. They want to see themselves moving forward with something. And sort of we're hearing that is, it's that combination of they want to use their strengths, they want to learn new skills, and meeting them in that space, rather than saying, here's a volunteer position that we need for you to have, you need these specific skills. What do you have, and what can you offer us? Does that help?
Great. Yeah, I think that's a really good answer. There was another question that came in. Now they're coming in kind of fast and furious here. Is the criminal record check required in general, and how important is it in a nonprofit organization? And in your experience, does it deter people from volunteering?
Whew, that's a loaded question.
Yeah.
By law, criminal record checks are required if people are working with vulnerable sectors. So we would identify a vulnerable sector as a child and youth, or if people are working one-to-one with that senior population. So there is some requirements on those, if people are, based on who they're working with. And then outside of that, it really becomes a governance piece of your organization as to if everybody is required to have a volunteer or a criminal record check. And that is a really important conversation to have at that governance level, because it is a part of your risk assessment. And the organizations, I think, that don't do criminal record checks, they're very clear on who that volunteer is working with and interacting with. And it's not required. Like it's definitely, a criminal record check is not required for all positions within an organization. I think the last part of that question was, what was it? Does it make it vulnerable?
Does it defer people? Yeah.
Does it defer people? In some cases, yes, criminal record checks does defer people. You have to ask yourself that question: are they the right people then for your organization? Why are they deferring it? Some people just don't like red tape. Some people don't want to have to go through a process. But when we come back that we're trying to make everybody safe and make sure that everybody has a good experience, both clients, both staff, volunteers, all of your stakeholders, we're trying to provide that safe kind of space for. And that's just how it is. I mean, it's just, we do turn away some volunteers who don't want to have a criminal record check, but those obviously aren't the right fit for our volunteers. We do definitely see more of our older population that don't understand. It's not that they want to defer a criminal record check, but they don't necessarily understand that volunteer management has evolved over the years, and they see volunteering as, well, you're just helping out. Like, so why wouldn't you just want my help? I'm here, I'm ready to help. And so just, I think, helping and educating them on the importance of the profession and the evolution of volunteer management.
Thank you. Another question is, do you have tips for recruiting volunteers in small communities where it can feel like there are not many people available or perhaps interested in getting involved?
Ah, yes. I think the biggest thing is making sure that you're actually asking people face to face. And I know that sounds like the most common basic thing, but we can kind of feel like we've got the poster up, we've got a Facebook page, we've got a newsletter asking for volunteers. And often people just really want to be asked, like one-to-one, to get recognized or to volunteer for your organization. So I always go back, well, why am I not filling this position? Have I actually asked anybody? Oh no, I've just relied on my database, or I've just relied on my website, and I'm thinking that that's going to recruit. I need to really go and ask people. Looking around, I think too, when we've got smaller communities, looking around at who's already volunteering within your organization, and asking them, who do you think would be a good fit for this organization? Do you have any ideas of people who we could ask to be a part of things? Obviously, in smaller organizations, there's a lot more ask, so there's a lot more tapping in on those resources. We've had some organizations who are starting to look at sharing volunteers from another organization, or at least having those conversations and saying, do you have volunteers that might be available on these certain days? And would that impact your programming? for your services that you're offering? And how can you collaborate with other organizations to, I guess, almost share your volunteers? And if you do go down that route, just be clear on expectations so that the volunteer knows that they're not just volunteering for one organization, but they are volunteering for two. Does any of that help?
Great. Yes, very much. So what is the best way to approach volunteer fairs? Do you have any suggestions, or is there a checklist that you know of for preparing an organization to participate in a volunteer fair?
I think it is always being prepared, having knowing what your volunteer positions that are open are, but also ensuring that you have sort of what does volunteering mean to your organization, making sure that that's really clear for people, because I think where volunteer fairs, what happens at volunteer fairs is people get kind of distracted by the cause itself, which is obviously a big attraction. The cause, the service, the program, which is obviously you want that to be a piece of your volunteer recruitment at a volunteer fair, but you also want, like, why volunteer? Like, making sure that that's really clear, the benefits of volunteering within this organization. Giveaways are huge at volunteer fairs. Those are the best things that you can, if you've got some sort of giveaway, if you've got a sponsor who can give you something where that person is then having to come to the table and actually have a conversation with you, and you're able to give them information about your association or your organization, then you've got an exchange. You're able to create an exchange.
Great. Thank you for that. A couple other questions involving the screening process, and if you have any specific advice about screening or resources that you could point us to that might exist on the website. And then the follow-up question is just, how do you recommend addressing an applicant that maybe even after screening or interviewing, it's clear it's not a good fit for the available positions?
Yeah, so the screening process is something that you can look at the 10 steps to a screening process at Volunteer Canada. And they've got great resources on what screening should look like and sort of the important pieces of screening. And then what was the second part of that question?
The other question was, how do you recommend addressing an applicant that after screening or interviewing, when it's clear it's not a good fit for the available positions? I think it's, how do you gently say no?
Yeah. Well, this is where you can really rely on any of your volunteer centers in your community, is being able to say, well, at this point, we don't think that this is the best fit for you. However, we'd really like to set you up with the volunteer center where we know that they can really sort of take you through that process and help you through and identify what might be a better fit. It's never an easy, I don't think it's ever an easy conversation, but you're doing, I think, always reminding yourself that you are doing, you're making the best decision, not just for your organization, but for that volunteer. And if, in smaller communities that may not have a volunteer center, maybe just have, if there's something that comes to your mind, having a list of other organizations that are looking for volunteers that may be better to support that volunteer where they're at, having that sort of available, directing them to something that you think that might have a fit. So it's not 100% no, but you're trying to support them in finding meaningful volunteer experiences.
Great, thank you for that. There is a question from somebody who is working at a small organization right now with a small volunteer pool already, but they would like to pull together a more thoughtful and meaningful volunteer program. And so is the Volunteer Canada website a good place for finding out more resources on this process?
Yeah, so the other piece that I mentioned at the very beginning is the Canadian Code of Volunteer Involvement, where they've listed out the 10 standards that you can start to incorporate and adopt into your organization. And it really comes back to that, the needs assessment and the planning piece, and taking that time to go back and set specific goals on what you want to work on in the 6 months, in a year, and looking through those 10 standards to say, okay, what do we want to work on, and what do we want to work towards. You can also, through the Volunteer Canada website, you can actually do an audit to say, and it will take you through a whole variety of questions, and then you can actually, it will tell you at the end of that audit sort of what areas that it thinks that you should work on. I can't remember if you have to be a member of Volunteer Canada to actually do the audit or not, but if you have any questions about where, what to work on, or how to work on a certain area, you can always use Volunteer Victoria as a resource, and we'd be happy to sort of point you in the right direction.
That's great. Thank you, Tracey. I may send you an email after this webinar as well, and just make sure I have the correct links to those two resources that you've been talking about, and I can send those out to all of the registered participants as well.
Okay. Yeah, that would be great.
Links.
Great questions.
Yeah, really great. So if you have a couple more minutes, there's one more question about what do you think of having a volunteers committee in your organization taking care of the rest of the volunteers, like the recruiting and training and et cetera?
Brilliant. I think it's the best thing you can do. If you're one staff, or you don't have staff, you're a small organization, definitely creating that kind of committee, I think, is only going to, you can spread the work then, and you can then hopefully have people with specific strengths focusing on various areas of that volunteer program. Many of you probably know Thrifty Foods here on the island and in the Lower Mainland is a huge grocery store chain that has over 500 volunteers. And the way they've made that volunteer program so successful is they actually have volunteer captains. Each volunteer captain is responsible for 10 people. So and those volunteer captains aren't staff, they're volunteers. And so they've been able to make this, like, when you hear 500 volunteers, that's huge. But they've been able to make it so much more manageable because they've broken it down, and that volunteer captain is responsible for a certain group of people. So whether you have that kind of structure, or you have a committee that can support the development of a volunteer program, I think is really such a great way to go. And what did they say? More heads, more, there's that quote that's like, the more heads you have that come together, you can actually do more things.
Yeah, I think it's something like many hands make light work, or something like that.
Yes, yeah.
Is there an ideal ratio, in your opinion, of how many volunteers one person should be in charge of? And the last question that I'll read out is that somebody's right now managing a 300 strong volunteer program, and it's all her. And I think she's wanting to know if there's an argument to be made to maybe divide that task among others.
Yeah, that's a lot. Congratulations. Yeah. Oh my gosh. That is, it's a lot. And I think I would go right back to the example that Thrifty's has, is what kind of structure could you put in place where you have other leaders who's in that 300 that you could say, could we have groups of 30? Could we have groups of 20 and have more leaders or lead volunteers that can help be almost those supervisors, help with some of the especially the recognition, the feedback, the supervision, the support of those volunteers. You might not be able to get sort of the support with the screening pieces. That may have to stay with one person. But I think, you know, what could you bring in to sort of break that down a little bit? Is there an ideal number? Well, I think that's the magic question. And then I think in our minds, there's an ideal number. And when we hear on average that a corporate supervisor is on average only supervising 10 people, is that the norm? I don't know. I mean, it just ranges so much. Personally, I think that ideally if one person overseeing no more than 15 to 20 people, I think that's a lot. If you're trying to build relationships, if you're trying to give them feedback, support them with training, all of these things that we've talked about today, you think about even 15 people in a week trying to have those meaningful connections. That's a lot of time. So I don't know. I don't have an exact perfect answer for that. I'm sorry.
No, I think that's very, very helpful. Okay. Thank you so much, Tracey. That was very, very informative. We are totally out of time. We had some really great questions from everybody. So thank you, everybody, for being so active and engaged with this topic. As for Tracey for leading today's presentation, BCMA will be sending you your very own BCMA mug.
Aww.
Enjoy. So
thank you.
In your office. And then I'd just like to take a moment now to encourage everybody to join us in May. Mark your calendar for the next webinar on Tuesday, May 21st, Making the Case for Your Museum, and it's Advocacy Strategies That Work. So, and we will it will be presented by Stephanie Halapia of BCMA's Advocacy Committee. And if you have suggestions for topics that you'd like to see in the future or wish to present one yourself, just feel free to get in contact with us. Also, just a reminder that we will be sending out a follow-up survey about this webinar, and we would really appreciate your feedback. We can continue to address your interests and needs. And then lastly, if you aren't already a member, please join us and become a member of the BC Museums Association. You will have free webinar participation, free access to all the archived webinars in the future, access to other professional development opportunities like regional workshops and our annual conference and special events. And mark the date for September 30th when our next conference will be happening in Prince George. So I think that's it. And thanks again, everybody. We hope to see you in May. And thank you again, Tracey, very much.
That's great. Well, thanks for having me. And congratulations again to all of you for being either a volunteer or a part of the volunteer journey.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy your day.